There's no doubt in my mind that this right here is the scariest book that I have ever read in my entire life. We're talking about face white as a ghost, sweat on the nape of my neck, absolutely mortified, kind of scared. I don't know if you've read a book like that before. I'd be interested to hear what the scariest book that you've ever read is. But this particular book is so terrifying to me. It does not have ghosts or goblins or ghouls or witches. It does not have chainsaws or machetes or anything like that. No creepy clowns in this particular book. It was not written by Stephen King or Edgar Allan Poe. But what makes this particular book that I want to talk about so absolutely terrifying is that almost everything that's in it is happening right now. It's becoming real. There's a part of our brain that does a very good job of differentiating between what is true and what is fictional. And so when we read certain accounts, while they may be very well written and have all sorts of twists and turns and things like that, plot lines that perhaps we can't see coming, nevertheless, they're not terrifying to the mind or to the brain because deep down inside, you know that they're not only not real, but not really very possible. So when you read a book like this one right here and you realize that almost everything described in here is actually coming true, it makes the book all the more terrifying to read through it. So what's up? We're going to talk about the book 1984 today. If you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, by all means, come check us out in real life, Gospel Fellowship PCA. Okay, so this book is terrifying. 1984, big eyeball on the front right there. It's so terrifying because it seems like it is becoming the playbook for authoritarian governments today. Now, in actuality, this book was written in 1949, and so George Orwell, who wrote other dystopias like Animal Farm, for instance, he's just seen the very brunt of some of the worst authoritarian fascist powers, of course, thinking perhaps of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, and Maoist China would be coming about as well. And so he's looking at the true wicked powers of government overreach, and he writes this fictional account. Now, I'm going to give you the plot line real quick here. So if you have not read the book before, you might want to familiarize yourself with the basic plot. If not, this is a bit of a spoiler for what's going to happen here. But I want to share with you in a moment 6 things that this book predicts that are actually happening right now in real life, and that's why this book is so terrifying to me, even more so. Every month, every year, as history keeps rolling through, it becomes more and more scary to me. So basic plot line, the main protagonist is a guy named Winston. He lives in a particular time of authoritarian government. And Winston's job is that he works for what is called the Ministry of Truth. Now, there's a lot of kind of ironic turns of phrase here in this book. Ministry of Truth is one of them because the Ministry of Truth is essentially the government's propaganda arm. So his job daily is to filter out the news so as to make sure to present the party in the best possible way. And you can kind of see how that could go wrong. Well, Winston falls in love with a girl called Julia, who actually works in the same building as him. And although their love is forbidden by the authoritarian government, nevertheless, they come up with a system of clues by which they're eventually able to meet and to rendezvous and to have a romantic relationship that is, of course, entirely forbidden by the statist government. And yet, they nevertheless try to carry on their romantic tryst. But unfortunately, of course, as you could probably predict, things are going to go awry when the government finds out about their secret love affair. Okay, so this is not a Christian book. If you're wondering, most of what I talk about on this particular channel is Christian theology, Christian books, devotional works, theological works, historical theology, things like that. But this book, again, is just so compelling because it's so disturbingly true. Now, 20 years ago, I would have never thought that anything like this could come about, but a lot has happened in the last few years. And the more our own nation tends to look like the party here that's described in the book 1984, the more terrifying some of the realities in this book are to people like me who are concerned with authoritarianism and statism rising in Western culture. So let me give you quickly here 6 things in this book that are particularly terrifying because they're all becoming real. The first one is one of the major themes of the book, and that is what's called Big Brother. Now, Big Brother is sort of the personalized authoritarian form of the government itself, taking on anthropomorphic language of a big brother. Now, Presumably, of course, Big Brother is there to protect you. I don't know if you grew up with a brother. I actually had two sisters, but if you had a big brother, the idea there is that he would protect you from harm. And of course, that's what statism usually does, is it presents itself as something that's there for your good. Actually, you exist for its good, but it will always tell you that it's there for your good. And what Big Brother does in the book 1984 is perpetual, constant, 100% surveillance. And again, that surveillance is always foisted upon the general public as though it's there for their own protection, but in reality, it is there to mine information from you. Now, this is one of the ways that the book is so terribly prescient, because George Orwell, writing in 1949, he could have never imagined some of the technologies that we have today to be able to do real government surveillance. He could have never imagined, for instance, a cell phone. But interestingly enough, George Orwell describes these two-way screens that are on almost every wall, every place in the workplace, even in the homes. Homes are bugged everywhere in the book 1984, so that the government can constantly monitor and surveil absolutely everything that you say. Now, just the other day, my wife and my daughter and I, we were in the van and we were having a particular conversation about this and that topic. And sure enough, guess what happened? And you've had this happen too. An advertisement popped up on my daughter's phone about the very subject that we were talking about. Now, we had no idea that our phones were listening. We should have known better, because this does happen from time to time. But somebody out there has wired the technology so that words that you're saying, key words, can be picked up, of course, and mined for valuable data and information. Presumably to sell you a product, but more and more so to mine for what this book is also going to call wrong think. More about that in just a moment. But these are some of the things that well, for instance, Eric Snowden warned us about a number of years ago. And all we thought, well, no, our government would never do that to us. Our government is benevolent. Our government is kind. Our government has our back. Our government is there merely to protect us. And if they were to surveil for any kind of information, it would only be to get those bad guys out there, not innocent persons like myself. Well, unfortunately, what we're finding out is that that is all too naive, because not only is Big Brother constantly able to mine our texts and our phone calls and our conversations in the van when we're talking about things that we had no idea somebody was listening to. But eventually, even those things, though those things may seem to be somewhat innocuous or inert now, if you fall into this second warning that I'm going to give you, then you might find yourself in trouble. And the second idea that's becoming very, very true is the idea of wrong think or thought crimes. In 1984, there are thoughts, of course, that are absolutely forbidden. You're forbidden from having particular thoughts in your mind. And even to think about such things is considered a crime. And so you certainly wouldn't want to be found guilty from Big Brother of having committed a thought crime. Now, we, of course, here, we enjoy our constitutional privileges, like the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is that we ought to have freedom of speech. Freedom of speech, of course, implies that we should have freedom of thought. But all the more, what we're finding out is that there are certain thoughts, there are certain ideas, there are certain belief structures that are no longer permissible. And what happens when you run afoul of Big Brother's view on ideology is that you will find yourself subject to cancel culture or deplatforming. And in very many cases, of course, we self-censor so that those things would never happen to us. In certain kinds of cancel culture, of course, you can find yourself knocked off of Twitter or knocked off of Facebook or banned from Pinterest or Instagram. But what happens when those lesser forms of cancel culture become more and more significant, such as if your bank doesn't want to do business with you or your credit card doesn't want to do business with you anymore? Well, then all of a sudden, these sorts of deplatforming exercises can become absolutely terrifying. If Visa or MasterCard were to deplatform you from the usage of their monetary system, then of course you would have a very hard time even providing for your family, getting groceries, or paying your mortgage on time. So deplatforming, though it seems like something that's only going to happen to, a Trumpian character or something like that, or perhaps those politicians that say really extreme kinds of things, well, every time you cut off the fringes or the very edges, then you get closer and closer to the middle. And that's where it becomes terrifying for people probably like you and me, who don't really think of ourselves as extremists. Most of the friends, most of the people that we have conversations with are people that believe something like us. And though, of course, we have variance and we give each other pushback, yet probably the most of us do not think anything close to that our ideas would be some form of intellectual terrorism, or that our ideas could or should be banished from society altogether. And yet this more and more is happening. Now, you may call me a bit of a fear monger here, and maybe this whole cancel culture, deplatforming ethos to our culture will simply blow away or go off in a few years. Who knows? I certainly hope that's the case. But I think we all kind of get it now, don't we? That there are certain topics that are not only taboo, but there are conclusions related to these topics that are absolutely forbidden. Let me give you 5 of them. First, traditional views on gender. Second, traditional views on sex and sexuality, including marriage. Third, race. There are certain topics related to race or conclusions even from data that we might draw that are absolutely forbidden. Transgenderism is another. Environmentalism is another. Even the pharmaceutical industry, which we would have never thought about just a few years ago, perhaps from COVID, there are certain conclusions or even interpretations of analytical data that are, well, they're wrongthink. They're thought crimes to have to come to these particular conclusions. And so this too is predicted in the book 1984. Third, the idea of the memory hole. Now, this one takes a little bit of explanation. In the book 1984, again, Winston, the protagonist, he works for the Ministry of Truth. And so in the way Orwell describes it is very old-fashioned, that there's newspapers and physical forms. I know some of you can hardly believe there was once a physical newspaper. I used to get one on my porch, right? And so Winston's job is he has to actually edit the newspapers, and he will cut things out and he'll paste things in. If a certain government official is now a persona non grata, he has to go through and he has to cut out that person's name and he has to stitch together the article. Again, and every once in a while, there would be an action or a fact or a story or a political encounter or some sort of occurrence in culture that he will have to throw the entire newspaper down what's called the memory hole. It's kind of like it when you go to the bank and you put something in that suction and it goes whoop, and it sucks up and takes your checking deposit into the bank. The memory hole is something like that. Now, of course, George Orwell could have never imagined what we can do on the internet with deleting people, changing stories, changing articles as they come out. Even using the powers of governmental intelligence agencies to just simply remove inconvenient facts from the public consciousness. Let me give you an example of that, lest you think I'm speaking out of turn here. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a very significant shooting at a Christian church in Nashville. In fact, it was at a Christian school. The school was called Covenant School. You probably heard the story, of course. But maybe you'll forget about this by the time you watch this video, months or who knows, even a year or so from now, as YouTube videos tend to stay in circulation from time to time. Well, the killer, the transgendered killer, was a person called Audrey or Aiden Hale. And before killing 6 people at the Nashville Covenant School, this transgender killer wrote a manifesto. Now, we were promised right away that the manifesto would be made public. But here we are several weeks later, no manifesto. And not only is there no manifesto, but now the authorities are telling us we might not get the manifesto at all. So they promised it to us, but now they are holding it back. Why? Because presumably it includes some sort of inconvenient narrative that doesn't go with the party's view of how reality should be. In other words, what the transgender killer wrote in this manifesto might lead people to draw conclusions that could be described as wrongthink or thought crimes. And so my guess is that the manifesto will be memory holed and we'll never see it again. If we do ever see it, if it ever sees the light of day, it's probably going to come in a very heavily redacted form with practically all of it blacked out for public consumption. Fourth, the idea of what's called new speak. Now, one of the problems for somebody who works in the Ministry of Truth is that in the party's system, They're constantly defining and redefining words. In fact, many of the words of the language are being cut out. Definitions are being shortened, or entirely new terms are being fabricated to convey ideas that never existed before. And so there's kind of this running joke about the 11th edition of the Newspeak Dictionary that's going to come out in this book. And of course, that's exactly what's happening. We are seeing today that words are being redefined, such as that their normal everyday meaning is now being totally obliterated. So we might talk about the word, well, woman. Here it is right there. Woman, for instance. It's a word that can no longer be defined. To define the word woman, biologically speaking, is to draw a wrong think or a thought crime conclusion in our culture today. And so we have all sorts of terms and vocabulary that we didn't have just a few years ago. You'd think that anti-racism, for instance, would mean that you're against racism. Actually, anti-racism is quite racist if you look at some of its principles. The idea of being cisgendered, did you ever hear that term? Did you ever describe yourself as being cisgendered? Well, probably you've never heard of that term. It was invented to ascribe to a certain category of people that have an identification of self-consciousness that goes along with their biological reality, their anatomical structure. We call that cisgendered now. Well, I don't like to call myself cisgendered because I just think of myself as being a male. But according to Newspeak, you should describe yourself as that subset of genders that conceivably fits in a whole panoply of other forms of genders and sexualities. The idea of a trans woman or a birthing person or a menstruating person. These are all examples of what 1984 predicts would be Newspeak. Fifth, the idea of double speak. Now, double speak is when you say one thing, but you're actually saying the other. Now, interestingly enough, in the government, the fictional government that Orwell describes here, they have four primary ministries. There's four departments of government. You have, first of all, the Ministry of Peace. Secondly, the Ministry of Truth, which again, that's the propaganda arm that Winston actually works for. There's the Ministry of Love, which is the police force. And then there's the Ministry of Plenty, which quite ironically is the starvation or the famine ministry. So in each one of the branches of government, they do exactly the opposite of what it is said. And so in the Ministry of Peace, which conceivably brings about peace, it's actually code for the military-industrial complex. That part of the economic system which its gears can only churn by stirring up war and violence in order to feed itself and propagate new materials and new funds and, of course, new riches. The Ministry of Plenty, which ironically is really the government board that oversees the famine of the people so as to starve them out, is that function in which normal, everyday, hardworking people are deprived of the very things that they're working so hard to keep. Interestingly enough, we just saw a couple of examples of these kinds of governmental conceptions in the Biden administration. So how about this? Are you familiar with Biden's proposed misinformation board a couple of months ago? Well, it went nowhere, and thankfully, quite thankfully for most of us, I think, it was disbanded. But once again, we're seeing this idea crop up again with the artificial intelligence concept, over which Kamala Harris apparently has recently been proposed to oversee. How will artificial intelligence coincide with truth versus propaganda? Well, I have a feeling it's going to be a very nefarious marriage, isn't it, between artificial intelligence and propaganda. We've seen very similar things too in, for instance, the Dutch farmers. I'm not sure if you're paying much attention to that saga over in Europe, but farmers being deprived of their land, forbidden to farm on it, things like this, things that are inconceivable. We wonder how this could possibly be. Well, it seems to be a function of the Ministry of Plenty, interestingly enough. The motto for the government or the party is war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. And of course, the government wants to see people as ignorant as possible. The dumber you are, the stronger you are as a nation. So goes the saying, freedom is slavery. You want your freedoms, do you? Well, don't you realize that all those things that you thought were freedoms are actually racist and hateful and bigoted and all these things? And so one by one, we end up giving away the kind of freedoms that are actually cherished in a free people that are supposedly protected by a a constitutional republic. Okay, and then fifth or sixth, I guess, as I'm on my numbering here, the party. And you'll notice the definite article, the party. There are no two parties. There is only one party. And the party consists of this unholy alliance between the government that is in power, the media that reports on it, the corporations that support it, and the universities and the education, which presumably merely exist to further propagandize a people that are already struggling to find out anything that is true or real. And so when you see, for instance, the government working in concert with the media, boy, that is an absolute recipe for disaster. In my view, one of the saddest things that I've seen in my lifetime is the absolute lack of curiosity of our reporting media. Government seems to work best when media has a cantankerous or even somewhat hostile relationship with the government. In other words, media should always exist to expose the corruptions of the government. But what happens when the government and the media are working together as one party? Well, the media stops working. It only tends to want to expose its intellectual opponents. But it has virtually no curiosity whatsoever to expose any possible corruption in the main party itself. Of course, that would be counterintuitive to its own ends. And so when I look at these 6 realities that George Orwell describes in the book 1984, the more terrifying it is for me to realize that pretty much all of these are becoming a reality in our day. So just to review them again, we have Big Brother surveillance, we have thought crimes or wrongthink, we have the memory holding of any sort of real useful information that might work to unseat power as it is. It's perpetual desire to reinvent language itself in the form of newspeak. Doublespeak, which is the deception of government covering its own incompetencies at best and its own malevolence at worst. And then, of course, the party, which is the absolute unanimity between government, media, corporate power, and educational prowess. All right. Well, thank you so much for checking into this video. Even though this book is scary as all get out, I do highly recommend it. It's a great read. It is certainly a thriller, and I think you'll find yourself understanding the times a little bit better if you do. I'm going to go ahead and post a link in the description of this video where you can hop on Amazon and grab a copy of 1984. You better read it before it becomes reality. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots. We'll talk to you later.